President Trump, before calling the person responsible for the Manchester atrocity an evil loser, reportedly postponed a state visit to Britain planned by Theresa May to October, so he won't be coming here while he's in Europe. Instead, after today's meeting with Pope Francis at the Vatican, he'll be off to meet UK Brexit adversaries in Brussels. European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker and European Council President Donald Tusk, and then he's headed for a summit held by an organisation he's name-checked before when complaining that it didn't fight terrorism.
I complained about that a long time ago and they made a change. And now they do fight terrorism. I said it was obsolete. It's no longer obsolete.
Yes, NATO didn't fight terrorism until Trump told it to. And it has gone from being obsolete to not being obsolete. Not sure if Trump meant that it has been NATO that has been involved in terrorist acts. After all, there was this in 1999, which arguably violated the UN Charter.
We have directed our defense ministers to determine ways that NATO can contribute to halting the delivery of war material, including by launching maritime operations.
Yes, that was NATO arguably illegally starting a naval blockade of Yugoslavia before some months later, President Clinton, Tony Blair and NATO bombed the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia.
We urge the US side to conduct deep and comprehensive investigations and to punish the perpetrator, and give a satisfactory explanation to the Chinese side. Only by this can the negative influence on the Sino-US relations be eliminated.
From effectively bombing China to failures in Afghanistan, it ended up doing this in 2011, supported by US President Obama and the UK's Prime Minister Theresa May. Labour's Jeremy Corbyn opposed it.
It appeared to be the heaviest bombardment of Libya's capital since NATO air attacks began. More than 20 strikes in and around Tripoli lit up the sky, and the booms could be heard across the city.
Not everyone's quite sure what position Trump has on Libya, Africa's richest per capita country, now all but destroyed.
I made a lot of money with Gaddafi, if you remember. He came to the country and he had to make a deal with me because he needed a place to stay, and he paid me a fortune, never got to stay there, and it became sort of a big joke. But the fact is that Libya was a disaster from the standpoint of the way it was handled. I mean,
but you were for interventions, just to clear that up.
I was for doing something, but I wasn't for what you have right now. And right now, ISIS has their oil, John. ISIS is selling, and that's among the finest oil in the world. ISIS has taken over the Libyan oil.
Yes, Trump saying that NATO catalyzes terrorism instead of fighting it. But given what Trump said in Saudi Arabia over the weekend, maybe tomorrow he'll argue for the use of NATO against Iran, which Trump said is responsible for terrorism, even though Iran and Trump's USA are apparently fighting on the same side in Syria against forces backed by Saudi, which sponsors inspiration for the Manchester atrocity. Well, joining me now is legendary filmmaker and journalist John Pilger, whose latest film is The Coming War on China. John, thanks for coming back on the show. Your reaction, of course, first to Britain and NATO nations, how they're trying to comprehend an atrocity like the one that took place in Manchester on Monday.
It's such an awful event, isn't it? When I read about it, it took me back to the Irish War. Time and again, an outrage. But what distinguished that, apart from the hideous brutality against civilians, was that no one dared speak about what's to be done, why it's caused, about cause and effect. And I think we've moved on quite a bit. 2005, we had the bombings in the London Tube. And I think a discussion really then began to get underway about why these things happen. What is the root cause? And we had several very interesting reports that are absolutely germane to these terrible events in Manchester. The Joint Intelligence Committee, just before the bombs of July the 7th, predicted what would happen if Britain remained in Iraq, if it continued its military operations in Iraq. We had a major CIA report basically saying this is using that word blowback for what the United States and Britain do in Iraq. But then most tellingly, perhaps, there was a Chatham House report, which was authored by Paul Wilkinson. Paul Wilkinson was very much part of the establishment security bureaucracy here. He spoke with that authenticity, and he connected the two. He said, in effect, that the bombs of July the 7th, 2005, were Blair's bombs. They were the bombs that were brought about because of Britain's invasion of Iraq, but its whole historic role in the mayhem, exploitation, and suffering of the Middle East, of this place, of this treasure trove of fossil fuels and of tribal enmities particularly, and of great enmities between Sunni autocratic kingdoms and Shia states. There they are because there's big bucks. You know, Britain had the Al Yamama arms deal, £25 million. They boast about this American one being the biggest. Well, maybe it's spread over a longer time or something.
350 billion, I think, was one.
It's going to be 350 billion over 10 years. Okay. That makes it the biggest. But they compete with the biggest. They compete with their voraciousness of getting what they want from the Gulf, from Saudi Arabia. And anything that stands in their way, and they see Iran, they've sided now, Trump has sided now openly with the Sunnis against Shia. This is a recipe for the most hideous disaster. And, you know, I'm not a futurist. It's also the recipe for more Manchesters.
Well, WikiLeaks tweeted a question and asked, because I can't remember a terror attack in Britain so close to a general election. WikiLeaks tweeted a question about whether ISIS is intervening in a UK election, just as there was an attack in France before the victory of Macron. Any possibility?
Actually, I don't know is the answer to that, but it's reasonable speculation. These jihadist groups from ISIS, from Al-Qaeda in its various forms, particularly Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is probably the most successful, al-Nusra in Syria, they know how to intervene. They know how to manipulate the media. We had the white helmets, a complete propaganda construct in Syria. They end up getting an Academy Award. They know how to intervene in public discourse every day and in politics every day. So that suggestion by WikiLeaks may well have a great deal of validity. I don't know.
Because in this general election, I mean, it's notable, the SNP, the Lib Dems, the Greens, UKIP, Jeremy Corbyn didn't want to intervene de facto on the side of ISIS-Daesh against the Syrian government. And they're also parties that are critical of UK backing of Saudi Arabia on the onslaught on Yemen, whereas Theresa May and right-wing Labour parliamentary colleagues of Corbyn are on the other side.
This is an historical pattern. There's no change. Britain, especially Britain, the United States, in a rather cack-handed way, actually, because the different members of the so-called deep state, CIA and all the rest of them, they compete in their adventures. So they often get it wrong. But they've used Al-Qaeda, they've used al-Nusra, they've used ISIS in the Podesta cables that WikiLeaks published. You know, there we had Hillary Clinton being informed openly that the connection between the Gulf states and ISIS was made, and yet she was backing, as the US Secretary of State, she was backing the same Gulf states,
but we know
and her foundation was a beneficiary of it.
But we know this from WikiLeaks, as you say, but even if what was revealed may illuminate what catalyzed the Manchester atrocity, Scotland Yard wants to arrest the founder of WikiLeaks. What do you make of that?
All that is left now is a bail infringement. Sweden's gone, that's it. Unless, in the shadows, there is the United States, and there is a secret grand jury indictment, undoubtedly, that is aimed at putting Julian Assange in the similar hellhole that Chelsea Manning has just got herself out of. Now, the threat to Julian Assange, obviously, is that if he leaves the embassy and is arrested for infringement of bail by the Metropolitan Police and put in custody. That makes him vulnerable while the US prepares its application to the British courts for extradition of him. We don't know if that will happen precisely that way. But they have certainly prepared, all the cables show this, perhaps historically, the biggest case they can do. I think it's the biggest because they've had a lot of difficulty doing it. Because what WikiLeaks has done and what Assange has done is not a criminal offence in the United States if they were Americans. And if he was an American, he's not, but it's not a criminal offence. He is protected by the First Amendment of the US Constitution. So they've had a lot of problems. They're early. Their first attempt was to use an old World War I act, the Espionage Act, which was used against pacifists and conscientious objectors during the First World War, all those 100 years ago. That's how desperate they are, to try and contrive something, contrive a prosecution to get their hands on someone who's actually doing no more than the editor of the New York Times when the New York Times does its job and reveals what's going on inside its government. He's doing no more than that. Arrest Assange, you should arrest the editor of the New York Times, arrest the editor of the Washington Post.
WikiLeaks is a global phenomenon. Obviously, both of our hearts go out to those relatives of those who have died in this atrocity in Manchester. Natural that mainstream media would be focusing on children here in Britain rather than children that may have died because of British overseas interventions in recent years?
I think it is natural. I think it is natural. And I know I can see the point you're making, but and having seen many children who have been affected and blown apart even by bombs in various parts of the world, I am only too aware that those children are no different from children in so-called our society. But I think it is natural. We're close to them here, and it's right that we are horrified, and it's right that we grieve. But we have to perhaps think of some mechanism, civilized mechanism, whereby we know about and we grieve the children who are grievously hurt by the actions of our governments, by the cluster bombs that fall on them, cluster bombs in the Yemen, which are targeted by British targeters in Riyadh. British targeters. Children are killed. It's the same while Trump was in Palestine. A teenager was shot dead at a checkpoint by an Israeli soldier. Routine. We need to know about that teenager and his family, and it's very important connecting with the victims of criminal, rapacious power, be they in Manchester, London, New York, Yemen, Somalia, Syria, Iraq. It's important. Only then can we understand.
John Pilger, thank you.